As a homeless man approached Morgan Freeman, he asked for just $1. No one could have predicted what would happen after this seemingly simple and ordinary moment. What started as a small act of kindness would reunite a broken family and permanently change everyone's lives. Before we dive into the story, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed to our channel and supported us. Enjoy the video. The city was as busy as ever, constantly moving. The honking of cars, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians, and the murmur of conversations blended into the air. In Manhattan, New York, at the corner of Park Avenue and 59th Street, an elderly man sat on a bench across from a luxury restaurant. He wore an old, long overcoat, and his silhouette, marked by the passage of time, stood out in the evening darkness. His expression was weary, yet determined. Despite the wear and tear of the years, he had lost none of his grace. Beside him stood a cardboard sign with the words, "Those who show kindness will receive kindness." The man's name was Samuel. Most people never questioned who he was or even noticed his presence. But he was a man who carried the weight of his past on his shoulders and, despite life's hardships, managed to stand tall. Once, he had a family, a job, and dreams he held on to with hope. But life, as it does to everyone, had its own surprises for him. As Samuel adjusted his beanie, he shivered and glanced at the crowd around him. Watching the shoes of those passing by, he noticed polished dress shoes, ordinary sneakers, and heavy work boots. But one particular pair of shoes caught his eye. Spotless, gleaming black patent leather shoes, expensive and a clear symbol of status. When he lifted his head, he saw a man in a black suit standing before him. The man's hands were comfortably tucked into the pockets of his long black overcoat. He stood there as if unaware of his surroundings, uninterested in the crowd around him. Samuel narrowed his eyes, focusing on the man's face. That face, it looked familiar, but something was missing. He was trying to remember. The man stood there, seemingly oblivious to the bustling crowd around him, appearing almost like a glowing figure in the darkness. People nearby whispered to one another, some discreetly pulling out their phones to snap photos. His presence felt like it was about to change something. Samuel could sense that this moment wasn't unfolding in an ordinary way. But what was it? No one could predict how this moment would end. Samuel sat on the bench, slowly scanning his surroundings. Everyone was rushing somewhere, but he had nowhere to go. He took a step forward and spoke in a trembling voice. "Hey, can you spare $1?" he asked, his voice coming out softer than he expected. The man slightly turned his head, his eyes carefully studying Samuel. He didn't respond immediately. He remained silent for a few seconds. Then, looking directly at Samuel, he asked, $1? What are you going to do with it?" Samuel cleared his throat, caught off guard. Questions like these were usually laced with mockery, but the man's tone was different, calm and attentive. There was no condescension, no mere curiosity. It felt as though he genuinely wanted to know Samuel. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then lowered his gaze. People often saw money as nothing more than a tool, but something about this man's question felt different. "A coffee," he said slowly, "and maybe a sandwich." The man stepped closer. The murmuring of the crowd around them grew slightly louder, whispers spreading among the passers-by. A sense of unease stirred within Samuel, but something in the man's presence kept him rooted to the spot. "What's your name?" the man asked, his tone just as calm. Samuel was taken aback. Who asks for his name? No one ever did. But this man, he really wanted to know. It wasn't just a casual question. "Samuel," he said in a low voice, but most people forget it. The man nodded and smiled faintly, as if Samuel's words resonated with him. "Hold out your hand, Samuel," he said. "I'm Morgan Freeman." For a moment, Samuel froze, unsure if he had heard correctly. That name, it was familiar, too familiar. His mind struggled to process it. "Freeman?" he repeated, still in shock. You mean the Morgan Freeman? Morgan Freeman smiled gently. Yes, that's me, he said, but a name is just a name. Behind mine there's a story, a journey. Maybe you have a story too. Samuel. Samuel hesitated. He couldn't find words right away. Something inside him stirred. This wasn't just any encounter. Something was changing within him. For the first time in years he felt seen, truly seen. His eyes locked onto something he had been missing for so long. As the crowd around them thickened, Samuel reached out and shook Morgan Freeman's hand. In that moment, he realized something. Life could change at any moment, on any street corner. This was not just a coincidence. This was a beginning. 5 years later, Samuel took a deep breath, reflecting on his past. The weight of his life felt like a heavy stone pressing on his shoulders. But in some way, he knew that everything had to end sooner or later. The factory shut down, and I lost my job, he said, his voice heavy with years of pain. Then my health went. I couldn't pay my rent. He swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in his throat. His thoughts were a tangled mess of regret, confusion, and the memories of a man who had once been full of hope. After that day, everything just got worse. Morgan Freeman stood before him, his white hair carrying the traces of time, his deep and weary eyes reflecting wisdom beyond words. Slowly he turned to Samuel, listening carefully to every word. But his attention wasn't just simple interest, it was understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the depths of life's struggles. In his mind, each sentence Samuel spoke was forming a picture, framing a moment in time. Right then and there he knew. Samuel's words were not just memories. They were a cry from beneath the surface of life itself, searching for meaning in a world that often forgets. People were passing by with quick steps, their hands in their pockets, each lost in their own world. As hurried as they were, Samuel was equally still. Though the traces of his life and the weariness of the years weighed heavily on his shoulders, he stood there, unknowingly, in this street, simply living in the moment. Samuel, in his bewilderment, took a few steps, unsure of what to do, and wanted to walk away from the scene, then paused for a moment. "How's your family, Samuel?" Morgan asked, his voice slowly emphasizing its depth. Each word seemed to carry weight, carefully chosen. Samuel's gaze froze. Slowly his eyes drifted away, slightly distant. "My family?" he muttered, as if the words were becoming harder to find. "My family's long gone. Over time, most people have faded from my life. I had a brother, but he's in another world now. He hasn't called or asked about me in years." At that moment, Samuel's eyes became even more distant. Morgan could deeply feel the pain of the years. He had walked the same paths, his own losses, the people he once held close, old friendships, but he kept living. As he sensed Samuel's pain, a meaning appeared in his eyes. The losses, in fact, became memories that enhanced the strength and hope to survive. Samuel remained silent for a few seconds, then took a deep breath. It was as if he was trying to face the darkness inside him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. His voice was no longer as shaky, but it was still filled with questions. Morgan paused for a few seconds. He knew that something was about to change. Slowly but decisively, he smiled. That smile was so deep that for a moment it felt as if the world around them was spinning only around the two of them. "Because I can," he said, his voice echoing softly but powerfully. This simple answer left a deep echo in Samuel's mind. It wasn't just help. It was an expression of responsibility, of meaning. Morgan's gaze said, "Goodness is good." Morgan slowly pulled something from his pocket and extended it towards Samuel. As Samuel squinted his eyes, Morgan took out a brand new, crisp $100 bill from his pocket and gently handed it to him. "Take this," Morgan said, his voice growing heavy again, but with an underlying message. "This isn't just for a cup of coffee. It's a fragment of hope." Samuel couldn't believe his eyes. As he looked at the money, time seemed to stand still for a moment. It wasn't just the money. He started thinking about how deep the gesture was and how much difference it could make. "Really?" he asked, his voice still surprised, but now his doubts had faded. Morgan nodded slightly and took a step forward, offering a smile. "Yes," he said, "because sometimes the smallest actions make the biggest difference in our lives. A small act of kindness, over time, leads to a big change." Samuel realized that the man was not just offering money, but also a responsibility, a burden. This wasn't just charity, it was a commitment. Something inside him began to stir. At that moment, a new light was dawning in his life. Morgan looked at Samuel with deep understanding in his eyes. His face bore the marks of wisdom earned through life. "Samuel," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't just about the money. I'm doing you a favor, but I'm asking something of you in return." Over the years, Samuel had seen many promises, fake smiles, and insincere offers of help. But Morgan's voice was different. It was a voice forged through time, shaped by experience. His inner doubt was a defense he had grown used to. He wanted to trust, but how many times had that trust been broken? How many times had hope only dragged him into deeper disappointment? "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice unintentionally harsh. "I've been here for a long time. People don't stop to help. At least the ones who help without expecting anything rarely exist." Morgan, with the patience gained over the years, said, "I'm not expecting anything," his voice calm but full of belief. "But I know that a small gesture can be the beginning of a big change." He pointed to the paper in his hand. "There's not just an address there. There's a road, work schedules, counseling, a warm meal. You deserve more." Morgan's eyes seemed to pierce deep into Samuel's soul. It wasn't just goodwill in them, there was belief. "All I want is for you to go there." Samuel swallowed, trying to loosen the knot in his throat. He opened the paper again and read the neatly written address. Was this really an opportunity, or was it just another attempt that would end in disappointment? "What if I fail?" he whispered, his voice carrying a fear he could barely admit even to himself. "What if I mess everything up?" Morgan gently shook his head with a soft smile. "Everyone makes mistakes, Samuel," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering. Then, becoming a bit more serious, he added, "But giving up, that's the only way to lose." Samuel realized how deeply those words affected him, and for a moment he thought the noise of the city had suddenly stopped. It was as if the world had paused for an instant, and only Morgan's voice echoed in his mind. The crowd around them had grown even larger. He could hear people whispering. One voice rose clearly. This is Morgan Freeman." Samuel noticed the attention turning toward them, and his discomfort grew. He suddenly felt like he was standing in front of everyone. It was like being under the spotlight. But Morgan was unaffected. It was as if time moved differently for him. He was so calm that he could ignore all the chaos around him. As if reading Samuel's thoughts, he whispered in a soft, low voice, "Forget them. This is between you and me. What others think doesn't matter." Samuel felt the unease inside him slowly fade. For the first time in a long while, he truly felt seen, truly heard. Suddenly, something changed. With a determination he hadn't felt before, perhaps for the first time, truly believing, he said, "Okay, I'll go." Morgan smiled gently, but it wasn't just a simple smile. There was hope in it. There was belief. "That's the only thing I wanted to hear," he said, his voice soft but clear. He turned to Samuel one last time. "Remember, you have more strength inside you than you think," he said, his eyes filled with real trust. Samuel blinked, but the words got caught in his throat. He wanted to thank him, but he didn't know how to say it. Instead, he slowly nodded and looked at Morgan. Without saying anything else, Morgan turned and walked slowly into the crowd. Samuel looked back at the paper in his hand. It wasn't just an address. It was a new beginning. Samuel gripped the note tightly in his hand, holding it like a lifeline. Morgan tilted his head slightly and gave a smile. Then, as he walked away with slow steps, the crowd silently parted to make way for him. Whispers spread from ear to ear, but the only thing Samuel heard was the faster rhythm of his own heart. His eyes watched as Morgan slowly disappeared into the city lights. As he faded away, Samuel realized something long forgotten was stirring inside him. It was hope. He opened the note again, a simple address. But this was more than just a place. It was the first step toward reclaiming his life. The next morning, Samuel stood in front of the address. Morgan hadn't just handed him a banknote. He had given him a path, a choice. This was a modest building made of red bricks, located in a quieter corner of Cleveland. A simple sign hung at the entrance, Hope Outreach Resource Center. He watched people coming in and out. Some were carrying grocery bags, while others, like Samuel, stood at the door, questioning something. He felt the note in his pocket. His fingers traced its edges, and there was still some hesitation in his mind. In the inner pocket of his jacket, the $100 bill he had received that day was still there. Part of him wanted to keep it, never spend it, and hold on to it forever. But the other part, Morgan's words echoed in his ears. It's not just about the money. This was a chance to start over. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The building was warm, after the sharp cold outside. Stepping inside instantly brought relief to Samuel. Behind the reception desk, a smiling middle-aged woman sat. "How can I help you?" she asked. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then took the note from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "I was directed here," he said, his voice low but steady. The woman glanced at the paper, then met Samuel's gaze. She smiled slightly. "You must be Samuel." The words made Samuel pause for a moment. It had been a long time since anyone had called him by name. The woman gently guided him inside. "We've been expecting you." Samuel wasn't sure where his steps were taking him, but for the first time, he wanted to know. The next hours passed in a blur. Samuel met with a staff member, answered questions about his health, and discussed his past. At first, he felt uneasy, but the man's eyes showed no judgment, only listening. Then a plan was set in motion. A temporary shelter was arranged. A health checkup was scheduled. He was directed to a training program to help him find a job. Samuel was amazed at how smoothly everything was going. It felt as though, for the first time in his life, things were finally falling into place. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. That evening, Samuel sat on the edge of the bed in the shelter. His eyes drifted to the $100 bill he was holding in his hand. The kindness of a stranger, an outstretched hand. Every hand extended to him up until now had come with an expectation. But this was different. Morgan hadn't asked for anything. He had only wanted Samuel to get back on his feet. He was tired. But this tiredness wasn't from hopelessness. It was the sweet weight of a new beginning. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. Meanwhile, something was happening in the outside world that Samuel wasn't aware of. A witness who had recorded his encounter with Morgan shared the footage on social media. The video quickly went viral and garnered thousands of comments. Morgan Freeman's generosity is truly heartwarming. Now here's a real example of kindness. Samuel didn't know that the incident had turned into an internet sensation. He simply folded the money in his hand, placed it in his pocket, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time, he was truly looking forward to it. In the footage, the moments when Morgan Freeman handed money to Samuel and spoke words of encouragement touched the hearts of millions. While some saw it as mere showmanship, others considered it a true act of humanity. But beyond the debates, what the video captured was deep and sincere. After the incident, people from all walks of life started donating to and volunteering at the Hope Outreach Resource Center. Morgan Freeman's act of kindness had inspired many, but there was one person unaware of all the ripple effects: Samuel. He was focused only on the small but significant steps ahead, attending his counseling session, filling out job applications, and learning to believe again. Throughout the week, he began noticing small but meaningful changes in his life. The shelter staff treated him with more warmth. What once felt like mere procedures were now carried out with genuine care. They weren't just offering him a place to stay, they were encouraging him. Samuel's story had also touched others at the shelter. Those silently struggling began approaching him, sharing their fears. A newly arrived man lightly patted his shoulder and said, "If you can do it, maybe I can too." In that moment, a new feeling stirred within Samuel. For the first time, he felt he was here not just to survive, but to create meaning. Meanwhile, despite being at the center of attention, Morgan Freeman remained silent. He declined interview requests, avoided social media, and ignored all the noise surrounding the event. Because to him, this wasn't about fame or applause. Samuel's story was what truly mattered. Yet behind the scenes, Morgan continued working. The Hope Outreach Resource Center began receiving large donations. New programs were launched, and resources for helping the homeless expanded. A small moment had turned into a powerful movement. On social media, people started sharing their own acts of kindness, using the hashtag #PayItForward. Local charities saw a surge in donations and volunteer applications, but for Samuel, the biggest change wasn't happening around him. It was happening within him. One evening, as he sat in the common area of the shelter, someone stopped beside him. A familiar voice, slightly trembling, spoke his name. "Samuel?" He lifted his head, squinting to make out the figure approaching. The features seemed familiar, but time had altered them enough to make him hesitate. Then suddenly, he realized. "Paul?" he whispered, his voice filled with shock and emotion. Standing before him was his younger brother, whom he hadn't seen in years. Time had blurred their connection, but now, the distance between them seemed to be closing. The weight of lost years hung in the air, yet this encounter felt like the beginning of something new. Paul took a few more steps forward and drew in a deep breath. "I saw the video," he said sincerely, sitting beside Samuel. His eyes searched his brother's tired face. "I didn't know things had gotten this hard. I should have reached out sooner." Samuel felt tears welling up, but tried to hold them back. He looked at his brother with understanding. "It's not your fault," he said slowly. Without hesitation, Paul placed a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder. "But I'm here now," he said with determination, "and I'm not going anywhere." At that moment, the gap of years closed just a little. Their silence reflected the time they had lost, but also the things that could still be repaired. Samuel realized that he had the chance not only to rebuild his life, but also to mend his relationships. As days passed, the change within Samuel became even more evident. He no longer saw his story as a tragedy. What he had been through was proof of survival and starting over. He knew the road ahead was still long, but this time, he didn't feel alone. Morgan Freeman's simple yet profound act of kindness was more than just financial help. He had given Samuel something he thought he had lost, hope, and that hope had reignited the spark within him, allowing him to stand up once more. Nurtured by the kindness of a stranger, a life changed by the power of a simple act of goodwill, a man beginning to believe again. Samuel now knew that his past did not define him, and that he had the power to shape his own future.